So, Sanae Takaichi, Japan's firebrand, quite conservative prime minister, has just won a massive electoral victory. In fact, it's the biggest victory by any party since World War II in Japan, so a true success for her. Despite this, though, I feel she needs to be careful and wary of becoming the next Boris Johnson. Now, you might well be wondering what on earth these two could possibly have in common. I mean, one's a Japanese politician who's just enjoyed an incredible degree of success, having won this massive electoral victory in Sanae Takaichi, whereas Boris Johnson, in contrast, is a British politician, not even an elected politician anymore, as he's left Parliament. And in contrast, Boris, you'd have to say his career ended in failure after a bit of a disgrace and having to resign because of a scandal. So what could these two really have in common? Well, I think they're actually incredibly similar up to a point, and I'll outline why. Now, you'd have to say both Boris and Sanae Takaichi spent years within the natural party of government within their countries, Boris in the Conservatives, Sanae in the LDP, not being, quite at the very top table of politics and sort of waiting their moment. And also during that time, both had a reputation of, not necessarily being afraid of controversy and being a little bit of a firebrand within the Conservative movement. Also, after that, both entered a leadership election when they were both considered to be the favourite to win, but ultimately they both lost out to sort of more centrist, centre-right candidates who the party preferred, in Theresa May and Shigeru Ishiba. Thirdly, both tried again to run and get leadership of their party, succeeded, but they only did so running as sort of more right-wing candidates after a sort of more centrist, centre-right candidates had tried to lead the country within their respective parties and failed, and the party was sort of, eager to revitalise itself and look in a different direction, and he was elected as leader to resolve the crisis of Brexit and to get that through. In Sanae Takaichi's case, the LDP went through a series of sort of not long-lived successes to struggle with the loss of the credibility of the LDP and the slush fund scandal. So both were only reluctantly put in place after the centrists had been given a good run at it and after they failed once to try and run for leader. And finally, Boris, much like Sanae Takaichi, won a massive electoral victory and revitalised his party once he is in, much as Sanae has recently. He won the biggest party the Conservatives had ever seen since Margaret Thatcher. But within just a few years, as I say, it was all gone. He had to resign in disgrace, and then the party went on to lose in the next election and let Labour in. So this is the point that really Sanae Takaichi has to look on that. Having got in as a Conservative candidate after a series of centrist candidates, having revitalised her party, run from the right, and won this big electoral majority, she now has to look at what happened to Boris and try and avoid it. Now, I think there are really 4 key lessons that Boris can teach Sanae Takaichi and that she has to look to avoid if she's going to be a success in revitalising her party as sort of a more conservative leader and with this big mandate. The first thing I'd say to Sanae Takaichi is to choose her advisors very carefully. That's a mistake I think Boris made. She seems to be influenced to some extent by Taro Aso, but she has to think about who she wants in there advising her. The mistake Boris made was appointing an advisor who became subject to scandal. In Dominic Cummings, he had to resign, having broken COVID rules and going driving when he shouldn't have been. And Boris tried to hold on and keep him in office, but in the end he had to fire him, which made him look more weak and diminished and hurt by Dominic in sort of association. After that, it maybe wasn't quite as clear, at least to me personally, who was advising Boris. I heard some murmurs that perhaps his wife Carrie might have been advising him or suggesting policy to some extent. But I think where Boris really suffered was I don't think he had someone willing to speak truth to power and give sort of, common sense advice and tell him no, for pragmatic reasons you can't do this. I think a clear example of this is how what ended Boris's reign and forced him ultimately to resign was appointing Chris Pincher, who'd been involved in a series of scandals, and then more bad details emerged about Chris Pincher possibly having done quite bad things, potentially, after he was appointed as a deputy whip. Now, surely an advisor should have said to Boris, he's got this possible negative pass, and he didn't necessarily have to appoint Chris Pincher because he had Boris any number of Conservative MPs he could have looked to and chosen instead as a deputy whip. It's an important position, but not necessarily vital that he had to fill it now. And he could have chosen Boris, either a loyalist or someone else from within the party, and that wouldn't have blown up in his face and sort of been seen as the last straw and forced him to resign. So if he just thought about it and not necessarily insisted on this one appointment, I think a good advisor could have potentially steered him away from appointing Chris Pincher and that blowing up and ultimately ending his time as PM. Now, it might seem very trite and obvious to say, choose the right advisors. Obviously, in retrospect, you'd always want someone with good character who's not going to do anything to let you down when it comes to picking an advisor. But I just really think about choosing someone who supports you, but really focus on someone who's willing to be pragmatic, say things you might not necessarily want to hear. Don't get into a situation where you're in an echo chamber or where information isn't getting to you. A second factor is that I think both have to watch the centrists within their party and other factions. This is something I think Boris failed to do. Now, both had, as I say, initially a more centrist candidate chosen to lead instead of them. The party went with Theresa May instead of Boris. They went with Shigeru Ishiba instead of Sanae Takaichi. But then, in the end, they ended up looking to a more conservative candidate to sort of breathe a bit more energy into the party, excite the base and provide a bit of a different direction. But many of the MPs within Boris's party would perhaps have preferred still a more centrist candidate. And the same is true of Sanae Takaichi. Like, many of them within her party preferred Koizumi instead, and he was seen at one point as the favourite more recently to become the Prime Minister of Japan and leader of the LDP instead of her. So Boris, I think, really failed to sort of be wary of that centrist threat. He failed to either really keep an eye on them, keep his ear on the ground as to whether they were sort of on manoeuvres, and to sort of avoid creating a sort of a popular replacement. Now, you could consider whether Rishi Sunak was really a centrist or more of a right-wing candidate, because he did support Brexit, I suppose. But in the end, it was Rishi Sunak who the party were more comfortable with in the end, and they ultimately ended up choosing him as leader to replace Boris after Liz Truss. And Boris sort of put Rishi Sunak in a position where he could really hurt him by appointing him as Chancellor of the Exchequer. And it was from that position where he resigned and caused a lot of damage, and a lot of Conservative MPs ended up running behind him as the ultimate replacer of Boris. So he sort of failed to sort of really think about whether he was putting the right person in charge who wouldn't resign at a key moment and damage him, and also think about whether he would be attracting support from within his party and sort of keep his ear to the ground, as I say, to possible challenges sort of from his centre and the One Nations in his own party. I think Sanae has to do the same thing. Although she's very popular now and she has a big mandate from the members, it was only quite a narrow thing that she ended up winning the leadership election contest. So she has to think carefully about whether the centrists, after a bad moment for her, might look to replace her, who she's appointed to key positions, what she can do to sort of maybe win the sort of more centrist LDP over. Although Sanae has a big mandate and has brought in extra politicians, the same could be said of Boris, when he won a big electoral victory, but he still was ousted, so that's something she has to think about. Third, I would say focus on the core issues you were elected on and try to avoid being distracted. Now, I would say Boris was elected on 3 key promises, thinking about his rhetoric and what was in his manifesto, and that was addressing immigration and reducing it illegally and illegally, and bringing in an Australia points-based system, getting Brexit done, and levelling up, I would say, were the big key promises that came across to me from looking at that election. Now, in terms of immigration, it went up massively, and in fact there's a wave of immigration named after him, the Boris wave. So you'd say he didn't address that. In terms of levelling up, HS2 in the end ended up being massively curtailed, despite it costing a lot of money. And I haven't seen a great deal of levelling up during Boris's time in office, or since, to be honest, so you'd say that didn't particularly go anywhere. Now, I suppose you would say he did get Brexit done, which was the main thing he was elected on after a lot of frustration over this. But he sort of really failed to secure a clear vision for Brexit, I would say, and to sort of go to the next step and sort of say to the country why that was such a great thing. And you're now in a position where he's been replaced by Labour and Keir Starmer, and he's going towards greater sort of integration with Europe in many ways. And so you'd say in terms of Boris's legacy, really there's not a lot to look at from those key promises. Although he did get Brexit delivered, it's sort of being wound back a bit. Now, for Sanae Takaichi, I would say the 3 sort of 4 big issues she were elected on were to sort of revitalise the Japanese economy, secure it, deal with the cost of living and things like the rice crisis, and stop inflation in Japan. address issues relating to immigration, although Japan doesn't necessarily have the same type of immigration that the UK has. There is a sort of a contrast between sort of the desire to bring in immigration to fill skill gaps versus the reluctance from many quarters to have lots of immigration into Japan. But she also has to think about the economy, so that's something for her to balance, as well as to think about other issues she's talked about specifically. For example, sort of nuisance streamers, the minority of some tourists, given the amount of tourism that Japan has, who come over and behave badly. And those are all things that she's talked about, as well as the issue of people from outside of Japan buying land is something also she's highlighted. So that's an issue she has to look to address. And also I would very much say Sanae Takaichi ran on also dealing with the building up Japan's military and sort of securing Japan, as I say, building up the military and dealing with issues like the current tension with China. That's something where perhaps Sanae Takaichi was given a bit of a vote because she's seen as a bit of a strong leader who's perhaps in a place to deal with issues like that and sort of build up Japan's and address sort of global tension and threats that Japan might be involved in. So that's another issue Sanae Takaichi has to think about. Now, Boris, I would say, got distracted by a lot of issues. Obviously, COVID couldn't be prevented, of course, but I think you would have to say there was some degree of a drift, in my opinion, where he sort of took his eye from the ball of these key priorities that he was elected on, and he really failed to get a great deal of the changes he promised through. And so Sanae Takaichi, I think, has to think about these key things she's promised and focus as much as possible on those and not sort of get dragged away and focused on other issues. And finally, and this is obviously seems very obvious and easy to point out after the fact, but avoid a scandal, and particularly in Boris's case, the appearance of being a hypocrite. Now, it was Boris being accused of breaking his own, rules regarding Partygate and COVID lockdown rules that really damaged him, and it's the fact that it dragged out for such a long time and was sort of drip fed that made it so much worse, in my opinion, than rather if he just said, okay, I got it wrong, admitted everything and tried to move on. I think perhaps there might have been more chance of him staying in and ultimately not collapsing if not for that. So I think Sanae Takaichi has to be very careful with that sort of thing, and just be very wary that in this day and age, in the modern state of politics, given how often leaks can happen, given that leaders can be vulnerable if journalists get hold of things, if there's leaks, if they have political enemies who are looking for information on them, you can't really assume that something you do isn't going to come out. And so things she has to think about are scandals that affected the LDP in the past, things like the slush fund scandal, the Unification Church scandal. And so I'd be thinking proactively, how can I address those scandals and avoid further things coming out? Not saying necessarily that Sanae Takaichi is involved in any of those things personally, or that they might be an issue for her in the future, but if she has to be very proactive to avoid being embroiled in anything that turns into a long saga, which has happened for the LDP in the past and is what really derailed Boris Johnson and undermined his government in this long Partygate scandal, to avoid situations like those that created difficulty for Boris Johnson. So these maybe all seem a little bit obvious, but I think those are some things that sort of undermine Boris that Sanae Takaichi could look out for. Another thing I'd say is that necessarily, just because Boris had this big mandate that swept him into power when he ran as a Conservative, I think Sanae Takaichi's in a similar situation where there was a mood for change and seeking sort of a different leader within the country. I think that's true for when Boris was elected and recently for Sanae Takaichi. And so she shouldn't necessarily see the massive electoral win she's got as a massive endorsement of her, even though she is very popular, as I think also maybe Boris was as well. She has to think this is sort of a temporary mandate and it can be taken away. And it's not necessarily that people are permanently going back to the LDP and that they're going to vote for them forever in a similar way and that things have changed forever. They've voted for you because there's this sort of desire for change and sort of a different leader. I think maybe that's something that Boris didn't seize upon, that he won a lot of constituencies that the Conservatives hadn't won in a long time, and he maybe took that for granted, that this wouldn't go away, that this big sweeping swing of support went towards him would be there forever. Whereas because he didn't deliver on sort of his key promises and he was seen as not delivering on sort of this big, populist right-wing energy, the core things he promised, sort of the mood of change that was in the country, he didn't follow through on that in any real way. Because of that, I think people felt let down. They felt like they temporarily lent him their vote in many cases, people who were traditional Labour voters and voted Conservative instead. And you see in the following election how easily that was swept away. And so I think that's something Sanae Takaichi has to look out for. Don't assume just because you're very, very popular now that you can just sort of do the safe thing and just keep things stable, and it will necessarily, you'll always get the same amount of votes. You have to look to follow through on what you've promised. Again, it seems very obvious, but it's something that did wrong for Boris. And so finally, those are just my thoughts on some similarities between Boris and Sanae Takaichi and some of the pitfalls you can maybe look to avoid.